Hi, hello to all the viewers, and hello to all who are here, and from ADL Israel to the summit. This past year has been very challenging for Israeli society, but it was very much felt in ultra-Orthodox society, both in terms of the rates of morbidity, but also the connection to the parts of Israeli society that are not ultra-Orthodox. So we have a panel today to answer the question, is the corona crisis a turning point in Haredi relations with the state? It is a very big question, and we'd like to try and kind of turn it into specific broken down questions. So let's say good morning to our panel members, Yehuda, Meshi, Zahav, founder and chairman of ZAKA, and since last week, the Israel Prize laureate for lifelong achievement. So congratulations to you on behalf of us all. Paley, chairman of the Haredi Institute for Internal Affairs. Did I say your name correctly? We can explain what Paley means later on. Esty Shushan, founder and CEO of Nivcharot, the Charedi women's movement. Good morning. Not the only woman here with me. And Keidar, executive director of Israel Hofsheet. Good morning. Good morning, one and all. It is a big question that we will try to delve into, and it's not too hard to do. Three of the four of you are really living at the heart of the society, and I'd like to ask you very briefly, what does it mean to be ultra-Orthodox, to be Haredi in these lockdowns, the second and third lockdowns? You had an issue with an elevator, with a lift? Well, not to me. I heard people who were in the lift and somebody pressed the button, a non-orthodox person, and then if the orthodox person was in the lift, the secular person would even go in and look away or even spit and not go into this lift. So what do you feel about these stories? This really the fruit of the incitement and everything that happens around. At the end of the day, there is a result, an outcome. Yehuda says incitement. So there's a lot of reports about the data. Where was incitement featuring? I think COVID-19 magnified as it exposed many other failures, has really intensified this tension between the ultra-Orthodox and the secular, and it came with questions of identity. Not identity, the day-to-day. Did you feel things? Did you hear them? Did you feel that the ground was shaking? Yes, of course, absolutely. I felt that there was a combination, or rather a low point in the relations between the secular and the ultra-Orthodox. When did you feel that? Because, you know, many secular like to say, I have an ultra-Orthodox friend to kind of be proud of having such a relationship. So let me say, Merav, that because I engage so much with the Haredi Institute for Internal Affairs and with the Mishpacha journal, we have a publisher and of a newspaper here. Yes, so it's part of the theater in which I engage, and it was so hard to hear from partners, from people I know, religious people, not just secular people, who have said for years we believed in the ability to coexist, and no more. Something cracked within us. We don't know how to move forward from here. That was very hard to hear. Esty, did you have a day or more in which you felt that the Israeli person on the street is looking at you with suspicion? Yes, certainly. I think that our lives this year have been between social media, where we've lived, and kind of emerging to the supermarket and going out and buying essentials. And I certainly saw it at the beginning. First of all, when I went out with a head covering, a scarf, which is maybe more kind of signifies me as an ultra-Orthodox woman, as not a wig, and a woman screamed at me for touching her shopping cart, and felt like a bacteria, like a germ at that moment. It was very unpleasant, and that's when I felt, that's what it was like to be a part. That's what it feels like when a crack
אם כי אני יכולה להבין מאיפה זה צמח, זה לא צמח על רקע ריק, וכן.
אבל זה בהחלט פגש אותך, את אומרת.
פגש אותי כמה פעמים, ואני ראיתי את זה גם, לא רק כלפיי, אלא כלפי נשים אחרות, או אנשים חרדים אחרים, איך מתייחסים אליהם בכל מיני מרחבים ציבוריים שהייתי בהם, וזה די הימם אותי, כי לפני כן באמת לא יצא לי לחשוב על זה ככה ולהתקל בזה באופן
אז אורי, אתה הלא חרדי היחידי פה מסביב לשולחן, גם אני, אבל תשמע, באיזשהו אופן, אני אחרי כל כך הרבה שנים פה בחלק מהחברה הישראלית, אני לא באמת רואה את ההבדל בין האדם החרדי ללא חרדי, זאת האמת, אבל אולי נגיע לזה בהמשך. איך כשאתה שומע את זה, עד כמה זה מפתיע אותך, או שבעצם אתה מכיר?
מפתיע זה בוודאי שלא, אני חושב שאנחנו באמת לא...
זמן אמת, אני מדברת על זמן אמת.
אני חושב שאני מאוד מסכים עם התיאור של אלי לגבי זה שמה שקרה פה בסוף כנראה שם זרקור על משהו שהוא לא חדש, והעצים מאוד הרבה תחושות מאוד קשות. ואני חושב אבל שמעבר להכל, החברה הישראלית סיפרה לעצמה בשנים האחרונות איזה סיפור כזה בסדר, יאללה, אז יהיו כזה כמה איים נפרדים ונראה לאן זה הולך. והקורונה, בגלל הייחודיות והעוצמה וההיקפים שלה, קודם כל לימדה אותנו שאין דבר כזה.
כן, אבל אני מתעקשת לחזור לחוויה האישית שלך. אני ממש מתעקשת.
החוויה האישית שלי בהקשר הזה, כמו שאסתי תיארה, רובה לא כללה לפגוש הרבה מאוד אנשים שהם לא המעגל המשפחתי האישי שלי. אני גר בקיבוץ, לא יצאתי ממנו די הרבה.
שזה אגב סיבה טובה גם לדבר על העניין הזה. למה שלקיבוצניק חילוני שהכל בסדר, הוא לא צריך לחלוק מעלית עם חרדי, למה שבכלל זה יעסיק אותו? אבל אני דווקא מדברת על החברים הקרובים שלך, אנשים חרדים, כי אני זוכרת שבזמן אמת, אני שמעתי את זה באמת מהחברים שלי, החרדים, שהם תיארו לי את היחס של היום-יום, של לרדת למכולת, של לגעת בעגלה.
אני חושב שמה שאני שמעתי מחברים חרדים שאני בקשר איתם, יושב גם על האזור הזה, אבל יותר מהכל אגב, וזה בהקשר הזה לדעתי כמו כל ישראלי וכנראה כמו כל אדם בעולם בהקשר הזה, פחד עצום לבריאות שלהם, לבריאות של המשפחה שלהם, לפני הכל.
אתה כבר הולך לסיבות, אני הולכת
כי אני חושב שבסופו של דבר, התופעות האלה, וזה אגב חלק גם מהעובדה שבסופו של דבר, וזה קצת חוזר למה שאמרתי קודם על האיים, אין הרבה מאוד מרחבים משותפים שבהם החילוני הממוצע פוגש את
where the average secular person meets the ultra-Orthodox person. Okay, excellent. So I'd like to go back to you, Yehuda. There are no points of friction. COVID-19 has put us all in the same melting pot, but there are no points of friction. And you are among of the first ultra-Orthodox people who has found this point of friction in death. ZAKA's activity, and you are now at the heart of the consensus, and hopefully you're getting the Lifelong Achievement Award, but your activity as ZAKA was one of the first buds of such collaboration, the moment when the secular person sees that the ultra-Orthodox comes and helps them in their difficult time, and really helps them when a person close to them dies. And so when you come to the pandemic, you keep asking, where's everything we did? Where's all the work gone? Isn't there like a point of disappointment? Let me run on to the conclusion, because it kind of felt here, the atmosphere here. At the end of the day, I am optimistic. I think that just as we managed to overcome the virus and overcome the financial crisis, at the end of the day, we will overcome. Okay, but the problem hasn't been solved yet. It hasn't even started being solved, not in the education system, not in the welfare system. I will tell you a little story. At the end of the day, all the large first responders and organizations and Hatzalah, Ezer Mitzion, Yad Sarah, they are all friends. And we collaborate and we run on ahead with first responders. And I remember in March last year, I got a phone call at midnight from Moshe Bar Simantov, a man who was died. It was 47 in Netanya. He is lying down in the living room, on the living room floor, and nobody dares approach him. The family members are locked in their bedrooms, and it reminded me of the missiles that fell, that were launched in the Gulf War. We didn't know how to protect ourselves, what to wear in order to protect ourselves from this COVID-19 patient, and that's what we did. We did what we could. And I got phone calls from people saying, how can you get your people out of places like this? And I said, well, I take them to where I go personally. And that's the point. Even throughout this mess, we see the volunteers of all the ultra-Orthodox organizations being first responders and helping. Yes, but that doesn't solve problems or to give answers or solutions to challenges in ultra-Orthodox society. At the end of the day, you don't get the credit because there have been weeks here when everybody talked about the ultra-Orthodox society. They are sick, they do not comply with the rules, they have huge weddings, and it's very important to go to these places, not because that's the most important thing, but because it signifies a problem. And I want to ask you, was there a point where you're saying, we have been working for years, and when a person is afraid, they say, don't touch my shopping cart?
גם בכל התוצאות הנוראיות של הקורונה, אני חשבתי שבאמת בגל הראשון,
I think that in the first wave of COVID, I think that we saw in ultra-Orthodox cities, it wasn't the ultra-Orthodox mayor who are running the place, but the soldiers that everyone was against them are now climbing up to the 4th floor and Bnei Brak is giving us food. So they walked around trying to help us. We thought it would make a change. Were there any changes? People were being honored. And then the second wave came along, right, and there was a big debate. And they tried to get the Swedish and then afterwards, there was another discussion, and then the third wave also made a difference. And I think that we were one of the only ones who also criticized our rabbis as well. Yes, we'll get to that, because there has been discrimination in there, but in all kinds of things. But everyone is at fault, and there are reasons for each person to say why, and to justify themselves. And now move on to Eli, but the most important thing is that your activity, your charity work is wonderful, but as a critical mass to solve problems that don't have questions, it's not good. It's not good enough. And there are people like Eli who...
I want to ask you, Eli, one of the things that I feel is when people look at Haredi society, they see a whole block of problems, children who need to go to their schools, their Talmud Torah, because there are 9 children at home and they'll catch it from one another. And you say, I'm the person with the numbers. I am the person who, perhaps because I have the data, how much and what the extent of the problem is, I can also propose solutions. But before the solutions, if you could perhaps together with me point to the problems, and let's call them the challenges or barriers that need to be addressed in Israeli society. Let's start with education. So education is an excellent example. I'd like to tell you 2 stories about that. One is in the first wave, a little bit after Purim. We didn't quite yet know what was happening. And there was a suggestion to cut back activity in the schools, in the higher classes, not in the lower classes. And there was a decision to move over to remote learning. What does that mean for you? Remote learning means that there isn't a decision to close the schools. Yes, it's better for the children to be in school, but by Zoom, you can continue the routine of studies. But nobody asked themselves, how does that decision affect Haredi society? Do you understand the consequences of sending hundreds of thousands of Haredi children home when, as far as they're concerned, there's no more school? I'm not even going to talk about the matter of learning Torah at times of emergency. Nobody even asks if everybody has a laptop at home. Does anyone know how to use a computer? On the level of decision maker, the decision makers didn't have the wisdom to look at the numbers, to understand the complexity and the overcrowding, the density of the population. We gave the data regarding the density that forecast inevitable contagion. In other words, you're saying if the children in Haredi society, if they stay at home, they will catch the disease much more than if they study in capsules in the schools. I can say yes, absolutely, unequivocally, those were our proposals. We were constantly updating the Israel Security Council, but nobody was listening and everyone was expecting things to work out. So can that be translated into incitement? Because when you don't explain to the general population gets its reports. Rabbi so-and-so said this and Rabbi so-and-so said that. The children are going to school or not going to school. Nobody stops for a moment and says, understand, if they remain at home, the percentage of contagion will go up. And if we find an arrangement for them of capsules, and in Haredi society, you can find solutions because there are many young men who can come and teach in the schools. But here I'd like to move on to the second story. On the second wave, after the holidays, it was clear to everyone that we had to close the schools. So the heads of the schools went into Rabbi Kanievsky and he said, well, it's no choice, we have to close the school, but we need an extension. Even though the rabbi said what he said, give us a week so that we can figure out a way to do it, because we all want to keep ourselves from getting ill. And Rabbi Kanievsky, despite his opposition to stopping Torah study, he said, yes, take that extension. And this was with the health ministry and the health officials and experts. And this could have become the national model for schools. 10 students per class with social distancing, with tests, with control, complete control. And then on Thursday, we were told that the Ministry of Justice said that the Haredi schools could not be allowed to open as long as the teachers union doesn't open up the other schools. And at that moment, the crisis of trust, which had been building up, we didn't know what to do. And I didn't know about that plan that you are talking about, but I did learn that you are in good contact with the rabbis and that you show them the numbers. And I think that what you share with many people who should have had a meaningful role during the Corona period is the feeling that people weren't listening to them, that they weren't being heard. The Haredi society is divided up into different groups, and there is the Haredi. It's about 20,000 families. And how is it possible for an entire year not a single person came to talk with the leaders of that group, if the very fact of meeting with them would have lowered the tension? Absolutely. You may not agree with the distancing system. What do you suggest? Yes, in that sense, there isn't much difference between the Haredi and non-Haredi population. Everybody's complaining that people weren't listening to them. I assume that you are familiar with the subject, and I started to talk about the matter of education with Eli, and I'm very cautious with you not to talk about women's issues. I don't want to open up here a women's ghetto, but I do want to talk about this subject. As I see it, the matter of education takes us immediately to core studies, not core studies. And that too is one of the subjects that came up because we are talking about a population that we want very much to have the tools to be able to move ahead. And if it's not in the right context with the yeshiva students, and we're talking about the divisions in Israeli society, the fact is that a Haredi child doesn't have the educational solution. Not only were his parents not being listened to in the cabinet, the Corona cabinet, but his needs are not being addressed either, his or her needs. Tell us where that stands now. To what extent is that lacking? Schools with core studies, because there is a deficiency. We know that. It's not only that there is a deficiency in that area, and I would like to talk about other issues. Not only you have, indeed, this is one of the most hot topics in recent years. And this is because there is a certain Haredi representation that supports certain Haredi institutions that have their own political parties. And today, the children are moved in a certain direction and they have to study in those institutions. I am from a Mizrahi family. My daughter will not be accepted to a prestigious seminar, and I want to give her another option, and I don't have another option. And it's either a Shas school where only Mizrahi girls study, and in Haredi society, they know exactly how to label everything, or to there's no clear solution. Can you map out the Haredi education system for a daughter of yours? What are the options available to her? It's important when you talk about core studies, and it's important that this be said, girls do study core studies, the boys do not. And there are schools that similarly do teach core studies. It stops by 8th grade when they're sent to the high school yeshivas where they don't study core studies, but the girls do. And there are a lot of other aspects in education which erupted here and blew up in our faces because of the lack of alternatives for parents. Either they're not accepted in the mainstream institutions, or they themselves want to give their children the tools to manage in life. Doesn't it sound like something that has become too small for Israeli society? It's like wearing an old blouse that needs to be replaced. Yes, absolutely. There's a huge need, and I hear the parents all the time about this need to find alternatives. But you're talking, you connected the solution to the male leadership. And this is the time to mention that you are the founder and CEO of Nivcharot, the Haredi women's movement. And it started out with a desire to be represented in politics. The fact that today the Haredi leadership is so male and so closed, and there's no mother's voice around that table. So you hear that with the lack of solutions, whether it's maternal or women's, not everyone can be a mother. We're talking about the girls, your daughter. That voice of the women, of the mothers is not heard, and it all blew up in the corona. Where did you feel it blow up besides education? We talked about education and we talked about the children's distress, especially the girls and the Haredi girls. Where else did you feel this lack of women's representation, where your voice is not being heard in the House of Representatives? Where do you see that? All the time. I see it all the time. This whole this whole attempt to make the Haredi institutions that they the way they are presented to the public and caused so much hate. You know that the synagogues, where are our Knesset members when we were supposed to be protected, when a different face should be shown? And all we heard is that the Haredi synagogues, and not only the synagogues, they were closed to women during this period. Women could not come to the synagogue. They had nowhere for them to pray. There was no women's section. I can tell you that in Ra'anana, where I live, there were women and men in the outside prayers, but there was a stage when they talked about education, and it was only for boys. I found that personally offensive, I have to say, even though I'm not Haredi. The discourse was always about the boys and about the Talmudei Torah and the Keidar schools for boys. And it was quite blunt and clear. And I would like to move over to you, Uri. Tell me a little bit about what you've been doing in the past year. It's very important because what you did touched on the open source. I would like to start with what Esty just said. What we want to relate to, this is the opportunity created by this situation, is the understanding that the state has responsibility towards the individual Haredi citizen, not the community, the individual. And we're talking about sharing the board, and that's a different discussion. First of all, there is a basic duty towards the Haredi individual, their health, their education, girls or boys. The Haredi child in the state of Israel is poorer. I'm asking you, from your perspective. It's very simple. We know, we talked about numbers. Haredi society suffered more than any other part of Israel. They were more ill, more seriously ill, and in a disproportionate fashion. So why can't you say that the Haredi child is not getting what they need? Let me finish what I'm saying. I think this comes exactly from what Esty spoke about, from an effort to talk about to look at a collective, and I hope I'm not misinterpreting you, but to look at the individual person. We, for example, showed the figures of the discriminatory enforcement. The state is punishing them disproportionately. They are ill more. If you don't give them the right treatment, you are punishing them. But ultimately, it all rests on the question of whether these things need to go through the mediators, the politicians, as Esty mentioned, or the state has to say, I have responsibility to each child and each adult. And in that context, even if it is in opposed to Litzman or Derry's views, we will circumvent them. But they are the coalition members. And they only care about the Torah and not about the flower, as it says, about making a living. They do important work, and I don't have complaints to them in that area, but they don't care about the basic needs. They haven't become accustomed to look at the individual citizens. I'd like to give you it took 3 weeks until they started sending text messages to people, and for them to understand that there are people who don't get text messages. They have telephones, but they don't get text messages. And it was from what we tried to find out, we looked at we spoke to the CEOs of the cellular companies, and they said there's no problem whatsoever. The state just has to tell us there's no technical issue. I dealt with it. It's a little bit more complicated than that. You're absolutely right. This is an example where I completely agree with Ori. We spoke about the Haredi child. That is the person that interests me the most. And after that, I'm interested in the parents of the Haredi child. Does the mother of the Haredi child during this corona year, did she have a chance to survive this situation? I think what we saw is that mother, from what I know, and I think there are people who know more than me than that there was enormous social pressure on her to send her children to school, even if she knew that it was dangerous. The state created an approach here, and we can talk about the blame to assign to the Haredi politicians. I didn't vote for them. I'm sure that doesn't surprise you, but I think the state is the one that's responsible here. At any given moment, she says, okay, let's find this solution or that solution. And at a certain point, the state has to say enough. There are certain points where we place health above everything, even if it runs counter to the lifestyle of that community. I'd like you, Yehuda, to take this forward from this point. I know we're trying to find creative solutions, and we do find, and I'm sure you will tell us about it, and you may have your own ideas. But although you have said that you are at the heart of the consensus, and I would like to talk about the fact that it's not only the secular people and Haredi people. We know that the individual, the child, the family in Haredi society did not get what they should have gotten from the level of the knowledge and updating to the level of actual assistance. So it's clear that there are many charity organizations and third sector organizations, but I'm talking about the duty of the state. Do you think the state fulfilled its duty towards the Haredi individual during the corona period? There are a number of issues here. About a month ago in Jerusalem, there was a family, the Springer family of 14 people. The father became ill with corona or died of corona. And if you'd ask the family, what would you like to do? To be in a single room without going out, or be orphans? Obviously, the answer is clear. So we have to distinguish between the reality of the corona, of the people who didn't follow the instructions. I assume that they didn't do it. They didn't do it because they weren't explained properly. It wasn't explained to them properly how to do it. And now it turns out that the overcrowding is not just a problem of the individual, it's a health problem of the entire state of Israel, and it's an economic problem. And here the state should have become involved, and it's not too late to do it now. It can be done still to solve this problem. It's not a problem that they don't have where to live. If people are living in corridors and in storage places or warehouses, that's a problem. You know, in Jerusalem, we see those things in Ashdod and in Bnei Brak too, but in Jerusalem, you can see it in certain streets, how public shelters are divided up into apartments, and the infrastructures can't serve the people there. And that's nothing new. Has the corona crisis exposed this? It's not a rift, it's not a crack, it's a bottomless pit. How have the Haredi, can't the Haredi politicians say for a moment, let's rest for a moment from matters of Torah and make sure people have a place to live? Let me give you another example. It's clear that if you don't study core studies, English and mathematics, they are crippled, they're handicapped. That's clear. Certainly English and mathematics. Some of them it says in the Talmud that a person must teach his son how to earn a livelihood. Who created the barrier that in public administration that you can't get a job unless you have a matriculation certificate and a degree? Who did that? The state of Israel did that. You have to hear the idea that he has to lower barriers. Tell us. I would like to respond first to Uri, if I may, because he touched on an important point here, and then tell us the story about the barriers. I think there is no better description of the huge problem as what Esty said, that still in the state of Israel, the approach to the Haredi society is like to a clan that things need to be decided with the muhtar, with the leader of the clan, and there's no discussion of civil rights and citizens' rights. There is a political interest here. They are a captive audience. How much? They have 6 or 7 Knesset seats for Aguda. They are a captive audience, as Esty said, and the politicians exploit that. The subject is not the politicians. I'm very familiar with the subject. The state of Israel has to decide. Just as Uri said, when Lapid was Minister of the Treasury, it's the first time that they moved the Haredim completely aside. And I wrote an article that I said it's time that now there's no Haredi politics, that the state of Israel write a charter of civic rights of Haredi style, what he has a right to get, a school, a road. Let's do it. And let me tell you a story. Esty spoke about schools, and I agree completely. There were Talmudei Torah that were flourishing, and there were parents, and I was involved in the establishment of a Talmud Torah school in Jerusalem. I'm not even talking about core studies. There was a model of independent studies which include these basic studies. That was the model in Jerusalem for many years in Lochter School, and there were many rabbis that studied in that school. I was involved in a program like this of the Ministry of Education for parents who wanted this, and there are quite a few parents who do want it. I'd like to go back to Uri. The politicians, the Haredi politicians, obstructed it, and the parents petitioned the High Court of Justice to enable the local governments to open a school, and the parents won the case. And it's not only related to Israeli politics. I want to go back to what Uri said because that's the key. And let me finish the story in Jerusalem. We established this Talmud Torah school in Jerusalem, and I met with the assistant to the mayor in Jerusalem, and he said, you know how many classrooms are missing for the Haredi community, and that's 7 years ago, 1,300 classrooms for the Haredi community in Jerusalem. That's not related to the politicians, the Haredi politicians. So they should stop everything until they get those 1,300 classes. You agree that it's a matter of priorities. You certainly don't think that the Haredi politicians don't want those classrooms, but ultimately, when at the basis of the budget, the needs of Haredi society are not part of the basic budget, and every year the Haredim have to come and beg for what they need, money that every child in Israel gets. Tell us very briefly about your project, because it really addresses the issue, and it answers Uri and perhaps you too. One of the things I asked myself during the Corona crisis is, where are we headed? The crisis is very great, and you have to ask, what could we do differently? And there is the problem, of course, of not having women in Haredi politics. We know that, but how do we as Haredi society move ahead? We are 12% of the population in Israel right now. We are 25% of the children in the first grades now, and the state of Israel and Haredi society must ask itself, how can we build a future together? Not to solve the problem, but how is the state of Israel preparing for that? That needs to be the terminology. How can we, Haredi society and Israeli society, to prepare? So my main argument, when I tried to understand the failure on the planning level, as well as on the feeling of Haredi society, they're not part of the story. I said, imagine what would happen if 10% of all the people in the public administration in Israel, in the treasury, in health, in welfare, men and women, were Haredim. How would the decision-making process look? So how can that be done so that 10% will be Haredim? So we in our institute are leading a strategic program that is headed by Eli Parmur, who was the Director General of the Ministry of Justice in the past. 80,000 of people work in Israel's civil service, and less than 1,000 are Haredi. And Yehuda spoke about the barriers quite rightly. If we manage to bring the human capital, men and women, to be part of the civil service, not to concede, but remove barriers and advance adapted training for people. Forget about politics. I don't agree. Politics is still the issue. When we're talking about representation of men and women from the Haredi society, we have two Haredi society. There isn't even half a woman in any of them, and in the decision-making circles. I'm talking about men and women from all parts of Haredi society need to be part of the civil service and the decision-making process in Israel. He says, forget about the politicians. What do you say? He says, let's solve the problems on the ground. I say that we can't forget either of them. We have to deal with both issues. Men and women must be part of the decision-making process, and then when they feel part, they will have much more responsibility and play a much more significant role. But we need to look inwards. How was this crisis run by a group of men? There wasn't a single woman, a single voice of a woman, a single mother who would talk about how things look inside the home. Perhaps you should go to Rabbi Kanievsky and tell him, you allowed this and you allowed that. Rabbi Kanievsky, allow them to accept one of us into their ranks. I would be very happy if my learned colleagues would allow me to enter the rabbis, the homes of one of these rabbis. Women aren't allowed in. But you saw that women in the voting booth, Nivcharot was not a party. I say you men, Charedi men, deal with the issue when you don't have course studies, and then get a degree, and you put a fence up and you tell for women and you tell them to jump over it. You know what price a woman has to pay if she tries to run even in a secular party. We've had that. What price would a woman pay if she ran independently? Look at the price that a woman like me has to pay. I've been talking to you since last night, and now you surprised me. Yehuda hasn't said anything because I think Yehuda understands very well what Esty is saying. You understand that the voice of the woman who gave birth to the child who is going to the Talmud Torah school, her voice is not heard. Ellie, you've lived in peace with that until now. Don't you think the time has come to change, to enable the women's voice to be heard? The women, he's explaining to you what tasks women have to fulfill. You know that it's complex. I work for a newspaper. 5 of the editors are women. 5 of the 10 editors are women. Will your newspaper give a platform to a voice like mine that it's time for women to take part in politics? I think your view has to pass the test of public opinion, but I don't have a voice in the media. I want to answer your question, Merav. I am in favor. I write texts in my newspaper. Haredi media is completely blocked to me. You are a significant percentage of the voters, and when you're in the voting booth, you can vote as you like and you can run. We just have a couple minutes left, and we have Uri here, and we'd like to hear from Uri. I know it won't be easy. You have 3 minutes. Please take us to a place where we can feel comfortable about the commitment of the politicians versus the commitment of the government. That's even before we talk about the individual citizens. I think that ultimately, as I said earlier, the government's commitment is first of all to the citizen who is a citizen before he is a Haredi person, and they have to stand behind that obligation. And in places where there is a clash, the state must fulfill their duty to this citizen. Even if it is contrary to what certain rabbis say, the government has an obligation and a duty, and it must also give each citizen what they have coming to them if there is a crisis, as there has been now. What we saw during the corona crisis was just the opposite of that situation, where they must act in favor of the citizens and safeguard their health. When I hear Eli talking about promoting access, part of the music that I hear, based on my experience, is that access it will involve separate gender training for men and women, and I think that is something that will not pass in the public. Why not? Because in high-tech companies, there are Haredi women who come to work and they work in separate rooms. Why is that a problem? If you are an Israeli citizen, you will start to have to think that if you come to the Ministry of the Interior, when there are reception hours that are different for men and women, that's something that won't pass. Let me give you an example that is familiar here. When we started almost 10 years ago with the first 5-year program in the academy, Mano Trachtenberg came to the Council for Higher Education and he said the gender separation will only be in the classrooms and only for the BA. But what happened? The graduates of the BA came, men and women, and they said, why? I want an MA also. I want to have an MA. Why not? Ultimately, the state has to decide if gender separation is something it wants to expand. And it's quite amazing to hear that, but we need to conclude here. And Esty had a coughing attack here, but we'll thank her on another occasion. I would like, please, to sum up and give us a little optimism. I have to say that I'm optimism because we have the Haredi population. They are wonderful people here. The problem is that the Haredi man needs to understand something very important. And until he understands that, the situation won't be addressed because the state must do its job. But the citizen also has a duty to demand what he has coming to him from the state. Ultimately, we all live in the same house, and the house has to make everyone feel at home, men, women, and children. And we are all obliged to maintain the home, whether it's through voluntary service or other service, because the house falls, it falls on everyone. Thank you very much, Yedioth, Meshi, Zahav. Eli, would you like to conclude? On an optimistic note, I maintain that the state of Israel has not yet discovered the human capital in Haredi society. The volunteer organizations, 35% of Haredim, based on a survey, volunteer at least once a month, which is the highest rate in all OECD countries. But the leaders are always working, they're always talking about the Torah, but these are things, without Torah, we have nothing. But if we properly identify the human capital and don't get into those matters of gender separation or not, there was an amazing training program for the civil service, which the High Court of Justice stopped, which enabled Haredi people to get academic degrees because of gender separation. At the training stage, they don't do the training together. If they do training together, the Haredim won't come. And so that was stopped. And that we did about talking about the military, and we didn't even touch on it. Can Esty come to say goodbye? Or would you sum up, please? The summary, as far as I'm concerned, is very simple. We are ultimately seeing a situation where the coronavirus has placed a spotlight on things that people prefer to ignore. But ultimately, the question is whether we will take this opportunity and say there can no longer be a situation where the state does not take full responsibility for each individual Haredi citizen before they relate to them as a community. Are you okay? Yes, I'm fine. Would you like to sum up, please? I think that at this point in time, we need to look inward. I can say to my state many things. I can say to the secular public many things, but I think that we have fallen sacrifice to many political interests, which led the incitement. But when I look inward at my community and we asked ourselves, where was our responsibility? Where did we go wrong? What would we have done differently? Those are the questions that we need to answer. Thank you to all the members of the panel for this important discussion, and thank you to our viewers online. And I think that even if the disagreements continue, but this will be a disagreement in heaven's